any point. I'm going to leave lots of time at the end for questions, and that's really the beauty of this. It can be really interactive, and hopefully it will be fun. Imagine you're a teen, and imagine you've been told you have no school for a day, a week, a month, maybe for the rest of the year. That is a miracle. And then virtually the next day, you are told you have to be home, quarantined with your parents 24/7. You cannot be with your friends. That is prison. That is torture. And that is what our young people have gone through. And we're going to be talking about what the coronavirus era has been like for our young people, because it's certainly very different for them. First, I want to look at the teen brain and the tween brain. Well, first to know it's a highly sensitive brain, but it's a really smart brain. We used to think that teens weren't smart. Their brains weren't smart. They're actually incredibly smart. They're incredibly intuitive, but they have some liabilities too. They're very drawn to instant gratification. They're pretty egocentric, and they're an egocentric world. They're not the best planners because they're just developing that skill. It's a highly addictive brain. That's why things like vaping and drinking and drugging are so dangerous. But primarily what separates the teen and tween brain from us as adults, our brain, is the fact that those brains don't have a braking system. And braking system says, ooh, I could get hurt. I could hurt someone else. That's dangerous. That's immoral. That's illegal. That's wrong. They don't have that braking system. We also know that teens understand risk. We used to think years ago that they didn't understand risk because they're involved in risk-taking behaviors. They understand risk very well, but they're more drawn to the reward. That's why a lot of parents reported, they said to the kids, you must be home. It is safe to be home. But they're saying, Mom, Dad, look, all of my friends are out with their friends. And I read a story about a kid who snuck out of the house in the middle of the night to be with a group of friends because their brain is different, because they're drawn to the reward of being with their friends, and the risk seems small when you look at that. By the way, the observers are those risk takers, us as adults. We see that very intensely. We see the risk, but the actual doer doesn't feel the risk as intensely. So this slide talks about what's important to teens. So you might be thinking, wait a second, John, you made a typo. Parents and family are on the top. Parents and family are on the bottom. That is no typo. Parents are always important, even though our kids push us away and tell us that we're not important, but we are. Control, freedom, and autonomy. Let's think about this. They've done lots of studies of young people, and all the studies have shown that tweens and teens, that is the most stressful period in anyone's life. And you might be thinking, are you kidding me? They don't have a mortgage. They don't have a car payment. They don't have a job. That's what real stress is. Well, stress is about the degree of control we have. And during the tween and teen years, you have less control than at any other point in your life. Less control of what you do, where you live, those sort of things. And so that's why it's so stressful. And of course, freedom and autonomy is where it's at. They want to be autonomous. And during the coronavirus era, there's no autonomy. There's no freedom. And you know what? There's no control. We don't feel control over our environment. And of course, we know that things like connection through technology and internet and phones is great, but teens really crave being together and literally hugging each other, touching each other. So the connections are fine to sustain us, but they'll only last for a long time. Let's look at the issue of privacy. Oh, this is so big. Teens crave privacy. I was doing another webinar. I've done many of these, and I have many more to go. I was doing one, and I said to a parent, the best thing you can do for your child is take a walk for an hour or take a drive for an hour or two and leave the house alone to your teen. Most teens love being home alone. And as I was saying that, someone was typing into the chat. I actually tried that with my teen, and he was so appreciative. It's really hard to have privacy when everyone is around. And this is something that's so important. And of course, that big one at the top, friends, you can't be with them. And that is just a significant loss for teens. And of course, we've always known that mental health is really important, but it's never been so important. We talk about the surge in terms of physical health. The mental health surge will be it will be just huge. It will be like overwhelming to all of us. So we have to really think about this. And it's currently really hard now. If you have a special needs child at home, that's really hard for the child and for the parent. If you have parents, maybe they're not living together, that's hard to co-parent. Even if you have two parents home, this is really hard to do. And if your child has any kind of pre-existing mental health challenge, anxiety, depression, maybe they've been self-harming, these things will all be amped up. Primarily, I want to say to you, now's the time to dig in around social emotional issues and around mental health issues, because the surge is starting and it will be even more. And we're going to talk about that as we go along. You can see on this slide, everyone loves Dr. Fauci. Everyone just adores him. I don't know if you saw about 2 weeks ago, they said to him, if they were going to make a movie about you, Dr. Fauci, who would play you? And without missing a beat, he said Brad Pitt. Lo and behold, if you saw Saturday Night Live, Brad Pitt was playing him, and rightly so. His quote, you know, you don't make the timeline, the virus does. The virus has a timeline, actually. We don't know what it is. And that is one of the most difficult parts. We don't know what it is. If we knew what it was, then we could live in relationship to that. But we don't know what it is. And we're all experiencing a little bit of fatigue. We've been home for 4 weeks, 8 weeks, maybe even more. And fatigue is setting in. And I think that accounts for people being a little more lax in their safety precautions, and certainly some people wanting to open up their communities before it's safe. But I want to talk about, to begin with, what's on the left-hand side. This is a sprint in the beginning, a sprint to be safe, to get disinfected. How are we going to get our food, to get our systems in place? But we also knew it was a marathon. Like, this is going to be a long event. If you were an athlete and a sprinter and a marathoner, you train very differently. But we're doing it at the same time, and that can be overwhelming to us. There's a lot of loneliness. I was mentioning this at another webinar I did, and a parent said, lonely? They're with me all the time. Well, they're lonely for the things that are mattering to them right now. They're friends. There can be incredible loneliness. You can be in a room of 50 people, 100 people, a loving family. You can feel really lonely. And let's look at the grieving process, which we've all gone through. And these are good things not just to know, but to talk to your teen and tween about. The first part of the grieving process is denial. And I want to tell you what that sounds like and what it looks like. This can't be happening. That can't be true. That's a verbalization of denial. Then the next stage is typically anger. Who could you be angry at? You could be angry at our local leaders, our state leaders, our national leaders. You don't like what they're doing, what they're saying. You could be angry at God. If there was a God, how could God allow this to happen? And parents, you know this, your kids are angry at you. You've probably heard, are you kidding, mom and dad? All these kids are allowed to be around town, and you're keeping me in. You're the most restrictive parent I know. There's a lot to be angry at, for sure. Guilt. Oftentimes in the grieving process, we feel guilty. I know I felt guilty. I'm not doing enough. I had some groceries delivered to me. I felt guilty about that. So guilt can be part of the process too. And for a lot of people now, clearly they're in depression. And that's a tough place to be. Depression is anger pushed inward. And that's really hard to deal with if your teen is dealing with it, and possibly you're dealing with it yourself. And the last part of the grieving process is acceptance. And acceptance means you don't like it any more than anyone else, but you're accepting where we're at. Now, at any point, you can spiral back to an earlier stage. I know I've spiraled back to anger many times, but it's important to intellectualize the process and know where you're at. You see the word loneliness there again, not a typo. When you're going through the grieving process, you can feel particularly alone. Particularly, reaching out to people is so important as a parent, and of course, reaching out to your teens, and we're going to be talking about that. And we're going to see some changes in behavior. This is what happens when stress is so prolonged and is so deep. And again, we don't know the timeline here. And you might see some regression in your kids. You might have thought or said or witnessed, wow, they haven't done that for a year or two. Yeah, that's what regression is when we're under this kind of stress and strain for a long period of time. You can see on the other side of the screen, the first part says social distancing. When I heard that, I revolted. Social distancing? No. We need the social stuff desperately. But physical distancing is what we need to keep ourselves safe. So I try to use the term physical distancing because that really accurately portrays what I think is needed. Generosity, what do I mean by that? Well, we're all going to make mistakes. We're all home. We're all going to do things we wish we hadn't done, said things we wish we hadn't said. And we have to be self-generous, say it's okay, and generous particularly with our teens and tweens. Things are changing, and we have to change our expectations and just understand this is a very special and overwhelming time. Can't versus won't. I want to tell you what I mean by that. When our kids are not doing what we ask them to do, maybe it's the trash, maybe it's the laundry, maybe it's their homework, we have to ask ourselves is that they won't do it. Either they're lazy, they just won't do it, or they can't, meaning they don't have the capacity. How do you lose capacity? Prolonged stress, anxiety, depression. People who have those sort of mental health challenges lose capacity. So when your kids are not doing what they should be doing, ask yourself this question: is it they can't or they won't? Now, sometimes it's a shade of gray, but if you can ask that question and get to an answer, that will shape how you approach your child. And let's talk a little bit about happiness. Happiness has always been really important. We've probably said to our kids, I just want you to be happy. I want to tell you what some of the latest studies have said about happiness. It actually feels like pressure when we parents say that, because what does it mean? How do you achieve it? It's not quantifiable. There's no numerical part to it. So a better thing to say, particularly now, is given the coronavirus, what is something that could happen that would make you feel a bit happier? Some things we can't do, and we have to expect that. And let's talk about kindness. Kindness has always been in vogue. We know this when we're driving. Remember the days when we used to drive a lot and someone would let our car in and we'd wave, thank you, that sort of thing? Yeah, kindness has always been important, more so now than at any other time. I was walking around my neighborhood and I saw this and I just smiled and I took out my phone and I took a picture. This is a small act of kindness. It meant so much to me, and hundreds of people have passed this house, I'm certain. So little acts of kindness matter, both outside your home and inside your home to your child. And this is another act of kindness that I saw. I thought this was just lovely and reminded me I was walking with my wife and I was passing a young kid who was about 20 feet away. And I pulled my mask down because I wanted him to see my face. And I think these masks are certainly a great thing for everyone to think about. So let's focus on kindness because that's going to be enduring for us. And again, this is especially hard for teens and tweens. And one of my mantras is it's okay not to be okay. I want to say that again. It's okay not to be okay. And that pertains to not just our teens and tweens, but ourselves. If you're having a down day, if you're feeling down a day or apathetic or you don't have energy, that is okay. We can't torture ourselves. We have to be self-generous. And our teens have a lot of fears. They have their own fears about what's going on. They carry our fears with them. Maybe they've overheard you talking about your job. Maybe you've lost your job. Maybe you've been furloughed, or maybe someone else has lost their job and they're worried about you losing your job. They're worried about food. Now, sometimes they can be like teens and complain they don't have the food they want, and I don't have the makeup I need, or I have to get my hair done, or the things that bother them. And yes, they are teens, but what they're saying is their world has been disrupted, and this is really chaotic for them. So we have to focus less on kind of what they're saying and more on what it really means. Because if we're focusing on, wow, they don't have the deodorant they use, our response as parents is going to be something like, are you kidding? People are losing their lives, forget your deodorant. It's more than the deodorant, I promise you. And of course, there's a lot of heightened anxiety and depression and a lot of irrational thinking. It's a very different time. So we have to think about this time also as being very hard in terms of risk-taking behavior for teens. We know that when people are overwhelmed, they gravitate toward risk-taking behaviors. Drinking, drugging, self-harm. Now, maybe they're not drinking and drugging because they're under your thumb a little bit more, but we have to understand that they're thinking about it because this is a tough world to be in. And we know even for kids who are perfectionistic, this is particularly hard. It's really hard to be a perfectionist during this time. And there are a lot of factors to think about. As parents, we're always trying to find balance ourselves and talking to our teens about finding balance. It's really hard to find balance these days, let's really be honest. And boredom. Your teen has probably said to you many times, I'm bored, Mom, Dad. And you're probably thinking, I'm bored too. I've never done so many dishes. You're probably not doing a lot of laundry, let's be honest. We're wearing the same clothes a lot. There's a lot of boredom. We know that boredom correlates very directly with risk-taking behaviors. So we have to be careful about that. And of course, it's important to develop a routine. Kids want this. Kids need this. This is their sense of safety and their security. But within those routines, we have to be flexible. I've really recommended to parents that for the weekends, don't have a routine. If your kids want to sleep till 2 in the afternoon, let them do it. Now, we have to have some rules. Like the technology can't sleep in their room. That's always been a good rule because let's be honest, they'll be on it all night. When they wake up, they'll check their technology. Truth of the matter is I do. So we shouldn't be doing that either. And we have to be flexible and we have to have some rules, but we have to loosen them up quite a bit. Let's talk about you. I know we're here talking about your teens, but moms, dads, guardians, caretakers, you are the captains of the ship and you need to be in a good place. And when I first heard this term self-care many years ago, I thought, self-care, that's ridiculous. What are you talking about? Well, self-care is not ridiculous. Self-care is also not selfish. Self-care is about being responsible for yourself, consistently being planful about it, and it's about easing the burden. And there are lots of good ways to help yourself. Go on YouTube and see a mindfulness video. Being outdoors is one of the healthiest things we can do. And what I call healthy comforts. What's a healthy comfort? Well, a big bowl of ice cream is a healthy comfort. If you're doing it 5 times a day, that's not so healthy. But be generous with yourself and have a healthy comfort, especially now. Let's talk about modeling. This is something that can be really tricky for parents because parents are thinking things like, wow, I don't want to show my children that I'm upset, that I'm unnerved by this, and I'm overwhelmed. I have to tell you, your kids watch you all the time. And if you're feeling in that way, they know it. So you might as well talk about it in age-appropriate ways. I would have discussions that are short, not very long. And I would figure out how you can convey what you're feeling without overwhelming them. A lot of parents have told me that their kids really struggle in the morning when they wake up and at night when we're alone with our brains. Our brains are our own worst enemy. And one of the things that I recommend is to have a specific time during the day, maybe it's between 3 and 3:30, whatever you want to choose, and have what I call worry time. Here's what worry time is all about. You as a parent are going to sit down and you're going to listen to your child and have them talk about all the things they're worried about. You're not going to interrupt. You're not going to say things like, it's going to get better, don't worry about it. You're just going to listen, giving your kids license to complain and to talk about what they're scared of. Now, you might have noticed your kids have better conversations with you in the car. Yeah, they're captive, but mostly they don't like to have eye contact. So for years, when my kids were in middle school and high school, I had conversations in the dark where they didn't have to look at my face because when I was talking with them, they would look at my face and change what they were going to say. They were trying to decipher what I was going to do. So have these conversations, this worry time in the dark. This driving around is just not so easy these days, and see if that can't be helpful. Some of the happiest people I know live in the moment. They're not ruminating about the past. They're not worried about the future. But living in the moment, that's a tough thing. So for me, about living in the moment is shorter time frames. We see this with the governor of Massachusetts, for example. Now we have an extension of another 2 weeks. We probably will be indoors for another 4 weeks, but short periods of time. And you can see the bullet there. It says about information. A lot of places to get information from the local, from the state, from the national. The number one source of information has been and always will be you about drinking, drugging, sexuality, and about this. Now, I know you're thinking, well, I don't have the statistics. What do you mean I'm the source? You might be watching the TV next to your child and talking about it. That makes you the source. The processing is where it's at. Make sure you are the source with your kids. And again, at any point for parents, they can ask questions. Reducing exposure. Well, I can tell you, I had to turn off CNN. It was just too much for me. For our kids, that constant exposure is a risk factor in terms of anxiety, and we have to really realize that. And humor has always been important. Of course, this is incredibly serious and sad. I've lost a distant relative, a childhood friend. Many of you have lost people or know people who are struggling now with their mental health, physical health. But humor is always important. And I put this in because it's humorous. It's humorous. Now, of course, within that, we have to do all the things that are not so humorous, talking to our kids, acknowledging their pain. But we can also laugh, because if we're not laughing, then that's just going to be really hard for all of us. I want to talk about anxiety a little bit. You know, for some people, being at home right now is actually a relief. That may sound odd and counterintuitive, but I want to tell you some of those people. People who are really introverts. This is a relief. It's very hard to greet the world all the time if you're an introvert. I have a friend who's incredibly anxious, and when this happened, he called me up. He says, I told you there's a good reason for my anxiety. So some people who are anxious feel vindicated. You know, anxiety is powerful, and anxiety lies to us. Anxiety tells us that things are never going to get better, and anxiety makes our world small. Our world's small enough as it is right now. So when people don't get help for anxiety and depression, I know why, because it is lying to us. And why get help if it's always going to be this way? There are lots of anxieties on here. I want to start just by talking about a couple of them: OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, the obsession to think about it and the compulsion to do it. So maybe if you check the heat 50, 100, 200 times before you go to bed, or we often think about this as people who are washing their hands compulsively. Well, guess what? In the Corona era, that takes on a little different meaning. People who have OCD are shameful about it. They're exhausted about it. They hide it from people. And it is just a different world. But I have to tell you, they do that behavior for a reason, and a good reason to them. I know that sounds odd and counterintuitive, but it makes sense to them. Now, part of their brain is thinking, oh, that's not right. That's not healthy. But a large part of the brain is compelling them to do it. And I think OCD has been skyrocketing. We know that calls to 800 numbers, mental health 800 numbers, have already increased. OCD is going to be increasing. Let's talk about panic disorder and panic attacks. This has already been increasing. I just know from my friends and my friends' children. Yes, and let me tell a story. By the way, I tell stories about my wife and kids. They know about it. They've all approved it. I want to tell you a story about my wife having a panic attack. She woke up just a couple months ago at 5:28 in the morning. Panic attacks are not scheduled events. And she says, I'm having a heart attack. And even though I adore my wife, I immediately abandoned her. I ran down to the kitchen. Sounds like I'm the worst partner in the world. I want to tell you what I did. I went and I grabbed some ice cubes, and I ran up to the bedroom. I said, hold the ice cubes. And I wish I had a video camera, because this was classic. She looked at me and she said, I hate living with a therapist. I said, just hold the darn ice cubes. She held the ice cubes, and about a minute later, she said, oh, my hands are cold. What I was doing was recalibrating her brain. You cannot actually have a conversation with someone who's in full panic mode that's going to be helpful for them. And then another minute later, she says, how long do I have to hold these for? And I saw her panic calm way, way down. And this is where I really wanted the camera, because she threw the ice cubes at me. It was really hysterical. Panic attacks are real, and they're embarrassing for people, and these will be increasing. And PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that has already happened. Anything that is traumatic to you, we know that kids will be re-triggered by a sight, by a sound. Maybe they're in a restaurant 2 years from now and someone is ordering a Corona beer 3 tables down. This is what happens. We talked about the timeline for the virus, but I wanted to get something that's very important to think about. There is no timeline for trauma. No timeline for trauma. And we're starting to see the fallout, and we've only just begun. And here are some of the emotional signs and physical signs of anxiety. None of these will surprise you. These are very real. It does feel like you're having a heart attack, particularly when you're having a panic attack. And behavior, let me go back to this. Behaviorally, let me tell you what it looks like. My son suffers with anxiety, especially when he was in middle school and high school. He's a sweet kid. He's a lovely kid, but he was not lovely as an anxious kid. He was rude. He was defiant. He acted out. His eating was disrupted. His sleeping was disrupted. And everyone reacts very differently to anxiety. When I'm anxious, I eat a lot. When my wife is anxious, she doesn't eat at all. I can't relate to that because I'm eating tons just to make myself feel better. She cannot relate to me. So everyone deals with it differently, and it comes out very differently. And if we were doing this in a group, I mostly do trainings in front of large groups. I'd be asking the whole group, like, what's the worst thing to say to an anxious teen or tween? And some of you might say, it's not a big deal. Get over it. Calm down. We've all been guilty of saying things which probably haven't been helpful. Or my favorite one, it's all in your head. Well, of course, it's all in your head. That's what anxiety is. It's a lot harder to say things that are helpful. And here are some lists of things that are helpful. And I want to talk about these. But before I do, I want to talk about that conquering anxiety and getting it in a good place for yourself is all about living with discomfort. And we as parents, as professionals, sometimes avoid the triggers because we don't want our kids to be upset. That's not helpful. There are also lots of things that we have to think about when we talk about anxiety. We know that if your kid is anxious, there's at least a 40% chance that someone in your family, perhaps you, suffers with anxiety. We also know that cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and medication and exposure therapy is very helpful. Some of the latest literature about the best ways to help teens and tweens about anxiety is not working with them at all. It's working with the parents. There's a big study out of Yale, and they've been very successful about that. So we also know that girls and women suffer with this twice as much as boys do. But let's look at this list, and I want to go down to the 1 to 10 scale, and I want to tell a story about my son. Lovely kid, but an anxious kid. And I'd ask him, how's your anxiety? How's your depression? And, you know, he didn't have the words. He didn't have the wherewithal. And finally, I said to him, could you just scale it for me? 10 being the worst, 1 being the best. You can do this if you're a classroom teacher and you're watching. You can do it with your partner. You can do it with your kids. And every day he'd say what he was. He was happy just to give me a number. He didn't want to talk about it. 10 being the worst. Maybe on Tuesday he was a 4. On Wednesday he was a 9. And I could say to him what would have to happen to become a 4 again, that sort of thing. And actually, I ended up charting it for him when he was in school. And not surprisingly, his most anxious day of the week was Sunday, about Monday. Academic challenges, athletic challenges, social challenges. So we have to think about how we can communicate with our teens. And it's more important to understand where they're at than in learning things. And the last 2 things on this list are, how can I help you? We make assumptions about what will be best. We must be solicitous with our teens and tweens about how we can help them and tell them that we love them. This is from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. If you're not from Massachusetts, I know we have people from all over. This is a survey we do every 2 years. This is a typical school system. This is actually a real school system, a little north of Boston. And the numbers in parentheses are the factored out numbers. Very hard for a human service person like myself to do math, but I think it's pretty good. Before I get to this, I want to talk about protective factors, things that keep us safe. You being on this webinar is a protective factor. What Aubrey does is a protective factor. The town of Norwood does. There are lots of protective factors. A good park and recreation department are protective factors. But there are a lot of risk factors, and we're seeing a lot of mental health things. And I want to just look at the high school numbers. Look at the number of students who have self-injured. In this one high school, north of Massachusetts, we have about 300 students who have self-injured. Why do people self-injure? They self-injure for a reason, and a good reason to them. Now, it's not good in terms of their health. It's all about emotional regulation. It's much better to talk about it than to do it. But they do it because it expresses outwardly the pain that they're feeling inside. They tell us that pain is better than nothing, and they feel actually a measure of optimism, a measure of control. You see the discrepancy between male and female? Remember I talked about that before with anxiety? Well, some of the discrepancy might be biological, but some is in our culture, us guys, nah. We're not anxious. We're not self-injuring. We're not thinking about depression. We're not feeling this, feeling that. You can see the numbers in terms of sad and hopeless. That's their word for depression. These are all part of the suicide equation, anxiety and depression. I do lots of trainings around this. And look at the number of students in this one high school who have seriously considered suicide. 157 students. What if I told you wherever you're living now, that your local high school, that 157 students had diarrhea? Yes, I did say diarrhea in case you were napping for a moment. What would they do? They close down that darn high school. They scrub it from top to bottom. This is coming from Norwood, Massachusetts. Can you imagine? Channel 5 in Boston would say, diarrhea in Norwood. Like, you'd be retired in Arizona or Florida or wherever you're going to retire 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. And someone's going to say, where did you work? And they said, oh, I grew up in Norwood, or I worked in Norwood. And they say, is that the diarrhea place? No one would forget it. Well, diarrhea is not a lot of fun. It's not going to end your life. That will. And let's talk about suicide, because this is something important to know. Suicide is going to increase. We know already it is the 10th leading cause of death in this country. Things like cancer and heart disease are on that list. Most of the things on the top 10 list are decreasing. Suicide is now number 10 and increasing. And in fact, I know we have one person who's logged on from Nevada. It is now number 8. Massachusetts in Nevada. Massachusetts has one of the lowest completion rates for suicide in the country. And what I mean by that, when we look at suicide attempts versus completed suicide, we want to use proper terms. We're very low. We're happy about that. And the reason for that is gun control. States which have more restricted gun control laws have fewer cases of completed suicide. Think about it. It's logical. If you're going to use a gun to end your life, you're going to have a high completion rate. 2.5 months ago, I was doing some workshops in Vermont, right next door to Massachusetts. They have double the suicide rate we have here. We're rated in Massachusetts a B plus in terms of gun control. They're D or D minus, I can't remember, in Vermont. And that really accounts for it very much. So if it's the 10th leading cause of death, let's break it down even further. And let's do this. So in Massachusetts, and also this pertains mostly nationally, people between the age of 45 and 54 have the most number of deaths by suicide. So you're thinking, well, if that's the case, why are we always focusing on young people? I want to tell you why. Because between the age of 10 and 24, it is the second leading cause of death. And I want to give you a quick example here about the messages we get. You might remember about a year and a half ago that the government said, don't eat romaine lettuce. You couldn't get a Caesar salad anywhere. That would bother me a lot because of E. coli. Less than 100 people die of E. coli every year. Every life is important. But let's think about this. If you're from the Boston area particularly, imagine you're in Fenway Park and imagine looking to your left and looking to your right and looking in the dugout. Look at everyone at Fenway Park. Add 7,000 people for 44,000 people. That's the number of people that die by suicide every year in this country, 44,000. And look at the messaging from our government. Couldn't get romaine lettuce. My wife and I were cleaning out our refrigerator. I said, darn, the CDC is powerful. I haven't cleaned the refrigerator in a decade. Less than 100 die. Every life is important. 44,000 by suicide. When's the last time we got a warning about that? Never. And of course, I'm glad I'm talking to you around this time of year because the holidays are the worst time around suicide. Actually not. Right now, in the spring and the summer, the highest rates of suicide always. We have to be particularly careful with our young people now and always, but particularly now because of Corona. And there are a lot of different theories about why the spring and the summer. The latest is really fascinating. Some of you might have allergies, which pop up this time of year, compromises you physically. Well, now we're thinking that your compromised immune system might also be around your mental health. So let's really focus on teens. And of course, we have to understand about some of the myths. One of the myths I heard growing up and for many years, if kids talk about it, they're not going to do it. No, if kids talk about it, they are going to do it. They want to be stopped. Remember the mantra, it's not that they want to die, they can't figure out a way to go on living. As teachers, as parents, we're positioned to really intercede and really keep them safe. This is so important when you think about 44,000, the size of Fenway Park, plus 7,000 people. So you can look at these statistics and look at this one school, again, north of Boston, typical suburban school, 90 students had attempted to end their life. Wow. We've been really fortunate. We are in a state that has good gun control. This would not be true in Vermont or in Nevada, Alaska, Wyoming, states that don't have as restrictive gun control laws. And here's some of the signs of depression. When we talk about depression, it's more than sadness. Sadness is a part of it. If you're sad and you come out of it, that's just sadness. If you can't, that's depression. And what's depression? As I said, it's anger toward inward, pushed inward. When your kids are really angry about you, mom and dad at home, you should probably say to yourself, thank goodness, better to be angry outward than to be angry inward at themselves. And of course, there have been lots of losses for our kids. Loss of prom, loss of graduation. If you are an athlete and spring, maybe you're a baseball player, this is your reason to be. This is your status. This is your identity. You have lost a lot. There's a lot that we've lost. And maybe you're losing stuff because you're thinking about the camp won't happen or your summer program or anything that's important for you. There's a lot of reasons to be pretty depressed about things. And I think our kids are starting to realize this is long-term. This is going to impact my summer. We don't even know if we're going to be back in school in the fall. So these losses are real. And again, in some broad way, it might pale in comparison to the loss of a job, the loss of a life. But this is significant to your teen, and we have to honor it. We have to acknowledge it. There are lots of resources around. I really love the crisis text line for a couple reasons. One is you don't have to be suicidal or in a huge crisis to contact them. In fact, less than 5% of the people who contact them are suicidal. When I first heard about texting these things, I said, wow, we're texting? What have we become? But there have been a lot of studies about this, and they've shown some interesting things. One is that kids are more comfortable texting. They're going to be more intimate about their topic. They're going to talk about it more deeply and more honestly when they're texting. So it turned out to be a really good thing. You also see something up there, the National Eating Disorders Association. Why do I put it up there? Well, eating disorders are very interesting, particularly about this time. If you have a child or you know someone has an eating disorder, this is a really hard time. And I want to tell you why. We don't have a lot of control now. Eating is about control, controlling our intake, controlling our body. So we're finding that people who have eating disorders are really challenged now. And we also know that from diagnosed mental health disorders, that if you have an eating disorder, it has the highest mortality rate of any. And within that, suicide is number one within that. So we really have to think about that, and we really have to pay special attention to that group, or the group who are gay, lesbian, transgender. That group are suffering greatly. And if you're in the Norwood area, this is great. The Impact Norwood Prevention Coalition, Aubrey's organization, is really great. These are people who want to help you. Interface is a free referral mental health service. If you are a Norwood resident, if you're calling from another community in Massachusetts, likely your community has this, where you can call up and find some therapists in your area, probably doing telehealth. And Riverside Community Care is already doing telehealth. And I think the point is to reach out. Some of the most courageous people I know are people who are willing to say, I've got a problem, I'm struggling. And that could be a teen, it could be a parent of a teen, in terms of yourself or in terms of your parenting. So we've asked you to be thoughtful and ask some questions. I'm going to have Aubrey come back on if she can figure out how to unmute herself and ask me questions. And I'm ready to begin. There you are, Aubrey.
Sure, yeah. I have to be honest and say I got up for a moment to get some of that gelato I was eyeing as my voice came in the door.
I love it about webinars. Everyone's casual.
Yes. Anyway, so actually one question that I'm seeing across our social media pages from parents is, how can I motivate my middle schooler or high schooler to do homework, because grading is a little different right now. So I would love to hear your.
Well, this is a really tough question, and let's back it up a little bit. I read a great quote from Adam Sandler, and Adam Sandler said this: the American educational system wasn't built with the idea that I be my child's teacher. So, think about it. You're in roles which are very different. And you're maybe running the household and worry about a job. So you're not primarily a teacher, but you see your child being apathetic to school. And I want to tell you where apathy comes from. Apathy comes from a place where people can't connect what's happening now to the future. Why try hard? We're never going to get out. School's never going to be back. It's never going to be meaningful. So we have to understand that they're apathetic for a reason, and a good reason to them. And that's where the conversation begins. Like, I've noticed you've been apathetic. Tell me a little bit about why. Explain it to me, because it's much more important what they say than what we say. And I know that seems wrong, but it's really true. We have to understand about their brain. And a young child, a tween or a teen who says, why should I try? It doesn't matter anymore, is telling us a lot. You're never going to get that teen to work until you get to the bottom. When people have things to work toward, they're very capable and willing to do it. Right now, kids are really struggling, particularly the teens and the tweens. And I have to say, and I'm going to get in trouble with some of my friends who are superintendents, is if it were me as a superintendent in this country, I say forget academics, focus on social, emotional stuff, focus on the life skills around anxiety, around mental health. But you have to really deal with what's going on in their brain and what the source of their apathy is. And we know that apathetic teens are apathetic for a good reason to them.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask? You can either unmute yourself or go ahead and type it into the chat box. It'd be
really great to ask some questions.
Yeah, we've allotted enough time for that. So, well, while we're waiting for some folks to think of questions, I just wanted to mention on the resource slide, John had put up impactnorwood.org for any coalitions from other parts of the country. We have a pretty comprehensive mental health resource toolkit. If anybody is interested in that, please reach out to me and let me know. I'd be happy to share a Word version of it if you want to adapt it for your communities, with just some language on it that Impact Norwood originally developed it. But if you want to take a look at that. And if you think it would be useful for whatever community you come from, please reach out to me and let me know. So just my little.
Something I've gotten, yeah. Sorry, something I've gotten from parents is that their kids are angry at them all the time, and it's really tough. And I say to them a couple things. One is you don't have to be, the victim of this all the time. When my kids were in middle school and high school, I often gave myself a timeout. Like when my kids were abusing me, I say, I'm giving myself a timeout. And I go in my room, I read the papers that were stacked up there or a book, and I just have some quiet time. Something amazing happened. When I came out, they came in, they gave me a hug. That was really nice. Kids want to help us too. We forget because we're always helping them. And if you have a dog at home or a cat or any kind of animal that you're used to, like taking care of and being in charge of, let your child do that, because then something's relying on your child. It gives them a reason to get up, to get moving. It makes them feel good. So we have to do that. So you don't have to be victimized by your kids, but you also have to understand that they're angry and you are the logical recipient. Think about it. You adore them, maybe not all their behavior, and they are on their worst behavior. Matter of fact, the reality is most of the time, all of us are on our worst behavior at home. Think about this, if you're working outside the home, if you ever said and did at work what you say and do at home, you would have been fired 5 times over. We're all on our worst behavior at home. So let our kids be on their worst behavior at home. They're going to work out on us. Mom, I want to go out. And you need to explain to them why they can't go out with their friends, because your scale is really about your intention. And your intention has always been the same from when they were young, is to keep them safe. When they were young, it was about physical safety and a lot about emotional safety now. But now we're back to the physical safety. And they may not appreciate it. It's not like they're going to pop up and say, oh, thank you, Mom. Now I know you're keeping me safe, and that's wonderful. I don't want to see my friends anymore. No, that's not going to happen. But we need to treat them as adults and let them know what's going on in our brain also.
That's all very fantastic information. Thank you, John. Unfortunately, we have some questions coming in. So right. I'm going to start with Teresa. She made a comment that her teen is spending most of her day in her bedroom. It's not unusual, but she's still concerned.
Yeah, so our teens, first of all, they're fatigued. They're sleeping differently. And of course, they're online. We have to think about this online behavior. So we know that girls are impacted differently than boys online. We used to think it was just about time online, but it's about what they're doing. So boys are doing gaming. Girls are doing more of the Snapchat and the social media stuff. It's much more injurious in terms of their mental health, that sort of thing. If that were my teen and I dealt with that with my kids, I would have times when I would let them be in their room, figure out a way to go in there, bring their laundry in, figure out an excuse to go in there, but also say, you know what, between this hour and this hour, I don't want you in there. Or figure out a time when you can get together and both complain. Maybe between 7 and 7:30 every day, you're going to each share the terrible part of what we're all going through, giving them license to talk about what's going on. A lot of kids don't want to share with their parents because they don't want to disappoint us. Or maybe mom or dad are having a hard time, or you've been furloughed, lost your job. They don't want to burden us. It's actually cathartic for everyone to talk about it. So I used to do this with my kids, designated time when we could complain about things, and it was okay. It was really wonderful. Even when my son was born, I said to my daughter, what's the worst thing about having Jake and what's the best thing? It gave her license to be honest and to be real, and you can do that now.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. I hope that was helpful for you. I'm going to go to Lisa now, Lisa Tarabelli. I'm going to take her off mute. She has a question and a comment.
Oh, great. Thank you, Aubrey. Thank you, John. That was really helpful. I have a junior in high school. I also have a college senior. So everything you said resonates to him as well. I mean, I have a 21-year-old that's not graduating or having a ceremony, no spring fling, and will be moving out of an apartment he's lived on his own in 2 years and moving back into our house with us. So big adjustment coming up, and I didn't know if you had any advice on that.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so the adjustment is twofold. Let's talk about us. It's hard. We love our kids, but having them back at home, that's really difficult. So let's acknowledge that even though we adore them and we miss them when they're back, you made, for instance, around Thanksgiving in past years, like, it was great to have them. I'm so glad they're going back. It is a major adjustment, and we have to have a new set of rules. We really do. So of course, when my kids were in high school, there were one set of rules. My son moved back between jobs after college, between college and grad school. And you know what? I sat down with him. I said, Jake, what are the rules? I was asking him what the rules are. And he told me things which shocked me. He said, rule number one, when I come in the door, do not say hello. I couldn't imagine what that was about. I said, why is that important? He said, doesn't matter why it's not important. I don't want you to do it. I can do that. Every time he would come in, I'd have to stifle myself. He said, rule number two, if I'm around for dinner, I'll eat. If I'm not, I won't. Stop asking me if I'll be home. Don't text me. I never text him. I always made enough for a share for him. Most days he wasn't around, but he always came home and he had a second dinner when he came home. So we have to ask our teens what would be helpful. And we also have to say this. When my son moved home, I said, what do you think it's going to be like? And his response was classic. He says, the first 2 weeks will be great. After that, it will suck. He repeated that as we got into month 2 and month 3. And then he met a woman he was falling in love, and that made it particularly hard. You know, he was saying things like, you and mom need a break. You should go away. Well, it was really about him having the house alone. I knew that. But understanding what the rules are, if, you know, when they were younger, they had to be home by a certain time. They had to maybe wake you up when they came in. You've got to get on the same place about the rules, and the logistics are important.
Thank you. I think too, it's important to remember, I think for the kids in high school, they're still contained at home.
Yes.
For him, I mean, he's fortunate. He has a job to start in June at a school, but he may not start now.
Yes.
And then if he doesn't have his first professional job, what's he going to do all summer? And we all know that interviewing and job searching is particularly difficult right now. It's just a whole nother realm of we didn't think would be here, but we're here.
It's so overwhelming for people who are looking forward to a summer program, starting a job. The feeling of lack of control is going to be just huge at a time when kids feel like they don't have control generally, and now we have the corona part. And I guess I would say in a normal course of events, I'd say, oh, if you can be out of the house as much as you can, that's great. We can't do that quite as easily. But let's give our kids license to say, this isn't working for us, or this sucks. And possibly they'll sprinkle in something like, here's something good about being home. I really miss that. But I would definitely talk about the logistics. And when they're talking about the things that they've lost, your response, all of our responses should be telling me, as opposed to you get it back or it'll get better. Something coming back. Just say thank you. When my son told me about his anxiety, his depression, all of his mental health things, my very first response was always, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you. So I'm just going to scroll through these comments and make sure we address everything. Teresa Stewart said, it's important to remember that kids aren't giving us a hard time, they are having a hard time.
That's very good point.
Fantastic.
It's coming out, the anger is coming at us. Yeah, so again, we have to understand that we're resilient, we'll love them, we are the logical recipient. And I know you're thinking, some parents like, wow, if they act that way in the big world, they'll get fired, they won't do well in school. Most kids really understand like the home versus out of school. If they said those things to a teacher, they probably would be suspended, you know, when we go back to school, and they likely won't.
We have another question from Megan. I started this week enforcing more time out of their rooms and 2 nights a week of family game nights. Hunt a killer mystery game. That sounds really fun. Am I wrong to do this, and should I give them all the space they want? Last week it became so much I barely saw them. I know they need privacy and respect, but between just being in their room plus doing schoolwork, it seemed like I should step in and say be social at least a little bit during the day, ages 14 and 15 and a half.
Well, if you can do it, that's really great. But sometimes talking to parents, remember, they've had like 20, 30, 40 days of just us, only us. One of the best rules you can do is they have to be out of their room, but no one can talk to anyone. There's no expectation of reaching out and talking and getting people angry at each other, that sort of thing. If more interactive things are better, and whatever's working now for you probably won't work in a week or two. That is what's happening with teens. So you might have to change it up. Bribing kids is really good. What do I mean by bribing? If you want to do a family game, go get their favorite ice cream. Go cook their favorite meal. The important thing is that they are interacting with a balance of time being alone in healthy ways, and sometimes ways that are just silent, like I said, or ways to be with themselves, with their own thoughts. And that balance is really hard. When the weather's nice, if you have a backyard, it's really great. Let them be in the backyard alone. Let them fall asleep outside, those sort of things, those healthy things. But the interior space is really making it tough for teens, and they are desperate, as much as they love you, to break out in certain ways. But if you're getting away with it, meaning you're willing to do it, I'd say continue to do it. They'll let you know when you step too far, because they're going to say, you know, Mom, this sucks. I don't want to do this anymore. Then that's when you pivot. We're all getting very good at pivoting in this era. Other questions, Aubrey?
We have a really great recipe for resiliency from, I'm so sorry if I say your name incorrectly, is it Betty? I'm not going to read it out loud because it's long, but if you haven't looked at the chat yet, I would definitely take a look at that because it's fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you
so,
for sharing.
Nothing against resilience. That, I think resilience is important, but one of the things we have to do is self-generosity. And it looks like this. I'll use an example of my son. When he was in high school, he was a starter on the basketball team, varsity, and then he was on the bench, and he was deep on the bench. And I talked to him a lot about self-generosity, because he would beat himself up, it wouldn't help him. And he kept saying to himself, it's okay, it's okay. He wasn't happy about being on the bench. He wasn't happy about not playing, but he was self-generous. And people who are self-generous are some of the happiest people I know. I have to work on myself. When I do a presentation, doesn't go so well, I can be really hard on myself. And I have to say, it's okay. And I know some parents are watching this thinking, wait a second. Your example about your son is he's letting himself off the hook. No. He went to school early, made a deal with the janitor. He could get in early to shoot. He stayed after practice in the evening. He worked so hard. But being self-generous means you're not torturing yourself. You're not inundating your brain with all the negative self-talk.
Are there any other questions that anybody has? If anybody wants to ask via phone, you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like to do that.
Yep, and I can just kind of loosely sum up some things. You know, this is a really hard period of time. We don't have the timelines at all. If we knew the timelines, if we knew that things were going to be over on June 1st, even July 1st, even August 1st, we can live in relationship to this. We will be back. Things will be changed. Kids are very nervous about what's going to happen with school. They were elated to be out of school, and then they miss their teachers. And now they're thinking, will we be back in school? Whenever they return to school, there's going to be a lot of excitement and a lot of anxiety. With being in a space with a lot of kids, even if class sizes are smaller, just getting out of the house. When I went out the other day, literally, I was just picking up curbside groceries. I was a little nervous. I had to get gas. I was a little bit nervous. So understand we have to look about anxiety, and we have to talk about it. And if there's been an incident where your kid's anxious, maybe they've had a panic attack, we need to debrief about it, because that's the only way to make headway about anxiety. We don't want to ignore it. We don't want to ignore the triggers. We have to talk about it, because that is going to be very helpful for your kid. And what I would do tonight after this, I would go in and I'd go hug your kid and say, I don't know how the heck you do it. You got so much going on. They're probably going to push you away and say, are you on drugs, Mom? Are you on drugs, Dad? Send you to Aubrey for some drug testing, whatever they're going to do. But really, they've got a lot going on, and it's miraculous how they can navigate this sort of world and this sort of challenge at their young age.
We had another question actually come in while you were speaking from Heather.
Right.
She said, during this time, teens might increase use of alcohol and marijuana. How should I address these concerns with them?
Well, remember, as I said before, you've heard it several times, everything they do, drinking, drugging, thoughts of suicide, self-harm, they do for a reason, and a good reason to them. They're hurting. Now, articulating their pain, having good, healthy sources for dealing with things is the healthy way to go. So when people do things, I've dealt with suicidal kids most of my professional career. Whenever I dealt with a suicidal kid, which is much more serious, I say, I know you're suicidal for a reason and a good reason to you. So if you catch your kids drinking, talk to them about it. When my son was in high school and he came home drunk, many of you have had this experience. It was a lovely experience. I said to my son, Jake, I said, Jake, I know you got drunk for a reason and a good reason. He said, what are you, crazy, Dad? That's insane. I said, no, I want you to think about it. And he had some really good reasons. I made him go in the other room and write a list. He says, always interested in alcohol, always interested in drinking, always interested in being drunk and very drunk, hanging out with older kids he wanted to impress. He had some good reasons to him. And then I put in some good reasons about why he shouldn't. By the way, it's a long story. If I ever do The Secret Life of Teens and Tweens in Norwood, you hear the end of that story. We ended up going to an AA meeting because that really fit where he was at. But we have to understand they're doing it for a good reason to them. They want to, blunt the pain. Or maybe they're bored. We know boredom plays a role, or anxiety. A lot of our young people are telling us that they're doing these things because they're anxious. They're smoking marijuana because they're anxious. Well, in a perfect world, they'd have better emotional regulation and be able to articulate that instead of that harmful behavior.
Great, thank you so much. It looks like, so sorry, I'm just making sure I address everything. Yeah. So Kathleen shared another resource, parentingmontana.org has a good sheet on also what you just addressed, John. Let's see. Yeah, and anybody who wants the toolkit, I'm actually just going to type my email address in. That might be easier. Just shoot me an email just to make sure I don't miss anybody's email. And you can send me an email and I'll get that toolkit off to you.
The other thing I will just say, if people have questions, feel free to email me. People always say, well, what are you doing with that? Do you charge? I said, no, I'm not charging. I'm really about, supporting people. So if you have a question tomorrow or 3 years from tomorrow, please email me. I get emails all the time and I'm so appreciative. If you email me, I will email you back that day. Also, before you leave tonight on the chat, if you just take a minute just to write in and say what you thought about this. You liked it, you learned, you didn't like it. That would be really helpful too.
We have another question from Teresa, if you don't mind.
Okay. Yes.
She said, panic attacks can be really scary to experience and witness someone else go through. I love John's ice cube story. Do you have other advice on how to respond, what to do or not do if a teen is having one, or if they are having one themselves?
They always have it at the most inconvenient time to them too. One of the things that I always did is I forgot time, meaning whatever I had in front of me, that didn't matter as much as the panic attack that one of my kids was having. So forget time. There is no timeline. The body that can't do panic attacks for too long. We get pretty exhausted. It's not going to last more than 20 minutes for most people. The other thing that I really did, I sat next to them and I started to breathe. And I tried to get them on my breathing cycle. And you know what? It worked a little bit. It wasn't the be all end all, but I said that to them. Asking your kid, is it all right if I hug you, hold your hand? My kids like the physical contact. I do too. So that was fine. Some people are going to flinch. They don't want that. We need to be solicitous and say, what do you want? Now, some of our kids are going to say, I don't know, Mom. I don't know, Dad. I don't know what I want. You can say, all right, how about if I get you something to drink, some water? How about if I hold your hand? We have to be solicitous to them. And we have to understand, again, the most important work you're going to do about panic attacks is to say that you love them, because kids will think or say, do you still love me? My kids would always say that to me. Do you still love me? I adore you. I'm sorry you've had that. I felt badly that they dealt with that. And the other thing, we must debrief. Like, if this happens again, what would be helpful? That's where you're going to make headway and make panic attacks less severe and cut down on the longevity of it also.
That's great. Thank you. So you're getting great feedback. The presentation was very upbeat and positive and very helpful. We have another question from Pamela. What to say to parents who are using drugs and alcohol as coping mechanisms and doing so in front of their teens?
Thank you for that question. Yeah.
I have the same question. It's a hard line to know.
It's really interesting. There have been talk in a lot of states about closing liquor stores because people know that we're drinking more. In fact, liquor sales have skyrocketed. Now, part is people are hoarding, like toilet paper. They're getting huge amounts, but people are drinking. And we have to understand that we need to be in a good place. Our kids are watching us. How can you expect your kid to behave, in healthy ways when we're not doing it? So one of the things I would really recommend to parents is don't drink during the week. I know you're thinking, well, what's wrong with a glass of wine? your kids are watching, and you say to your kids, you know what? It's so easy to fall into bad patterns here. Just have a glass here. You know, I'll have another glass. I really like that wine. Set parameters where you're not going to do that. And say to your kids, look, I'm not doing it because I want to be safe and I want to be healthy. You're modeling behavior. I did that all the time. Whenever I have a drink, I'd say to my wife when my kids were younger and they were around, I'm going to have a drink tonight so mom will pick you up. I would never, ever drive, even if I had one drink. I was setting the stage for really them to emulate that behavior. So we have to think about that, drinking and drugging. And if we are having a hard time admitting it, some of the strongest people I know admit they're having a hard time and reach out for help, because you know what? You're a parent, but you're also a person, and that's important.
Those are all really great suggestions. And in Norwood, we've been trying to put out information about why substances don't actually help you cope. We want to make sure we're towing the line between not coming outright and saying, don't drink in front of your kids right now, it's bad for you, even though I love to just do that. But explaining why substances don't actually help you cope, because they don't.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah,
they're easy. We gravitate to the things which are easy and are not very helpful. It's kind of like the empty calorie thing.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
it takes a lot of willpower sometimes, but if you say to yourself, I'm not going to do it during the week and stick to it, that will be a good guide.
Let's see. We have another question, and a very good one from Teresa. Any thoughts or recommendations on supporting teens who may have family or friends pass away during this time of social isolation and when we can't be with people in the hospital or have funerals in the way we usually do?
Some of these stories are just heart-wrenching. You know, people dying alone in a hospital, not being able to hold their hand. I've lost, a relative, a childhood friend. We can't grieve in the traditional ways we have. You know, some parents are thinking this is like 9/11. This is nothing like 9/11. And 9/11, we came together. We could hold each other, be with each other. This is just so different. For kids who had a major loss, they can't get closure in the same ways. And there's no timeline for closure either. They may be irritated. They may be angry at us. It's going to come out in all sorts of ways. I'm going to go back. Just to show you, I had the grieving process up there. I'm going to just find it. Yeah, the grieving process. This is really hard. I don't think we're going to get closure in the same way. We can't go to grave sites. We can't go to funerals. We can't help people. We so desperately want to hold them and help them. And there's no roadmap for this. This is just such different territory. I don't pretend to know how it's going to play out, but I know this. It's going to feel very painful, and people are going to feel very guilty. They haven't been enough. They weren't there. They couldn't do this, say this, be there. So I think guilt is going to be a part of this process, which is really important to think about and talk to your kids about. One of the things I always did with my kids when they didn't want to talk about, say things to them like, would you watch a movie with me? We watch a movie about an anxious person or someone who's had a loss. They're very happy to talk about what went on in that movie. And then you can kind of segue it over to their own life. I also have to tell you that they have friends who are struggling too, with anxiety, with depression, with loss. And if your kid's not feeling these things right now, fantastic, but help them be a good friend to their friends. That's very important because it feels like a lot of pressure.
Definitely. Are there any other questions, thoughts?
Well, I've got a thought. Thank you, Aubrey, for having me. It's great. I thank everyone for being here again. If you can take a minute, if you haven't, just to let us know what you thought about this, if you liked it, if you learned. It's been a great experience. I hope I'm back actually in person in Norwood at some point. It'll be really fun to be back in Norwood.
You might be
it would
going.
Signify that we're kind of over this. I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Oh, you might have some across the country presentations.
Okay, well, I'm happy to do it. I think this work is really important, and I thank everyone for tuning in tonight, and I hope you got your questions answered. If you didn't, if you have a question tomorrow or the next day or 3 weeks from the next day, please email me. Again, I promise I will get right back to you with a response, because if it's important to you, it's important for me to get back to you.
I actually have one very quick question.
Sure.
Can we make these slides available in PDF format for the folks who attended?
Yeah, so you can just put them on their website, on your website. Do you want that?
Perfect. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, we had a question at the beginning, and I thought you would say
please
yes,
do.
but I wanted to double check.
Yeah, thank you. We want to, we want to share the information. Thank everyone for giving me an hour and 10 minutes of your time. I'm so appreciative, and I hope it will be helpful. And for you, Aubrey, let's give me a call after this. We'll chat on the phone for a moment.
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you all. Take
Good night.
care. Good night. All right, John, I'll give you a call.